I came home early to surprise my wife, but what I found shattered my entire world. Hidden cameras, secret affairs, and a betrayal deeper than I ever imagined. This is the story of how I uncovered the truth and took my life back. While scanning the restaurant for the client I was supposed to meet, my gaze unexpectedly landed on someone familiar, my ex-wife, Susan. She was seated with a slightly overweight, middle-aged man. His appearance gave away a past marked by fitness, though the years and indulgence in fine food had softened his once athletic build. Susan, however, looked radiant, practically glowing as she sat close to him. Everything about the man, his tailored suit, polished demeanor, and expensive watch, screamed wealth. Standing in the foyer, I couldn't help but pause. A wave of memories hit me, each one pulling me back to the life we once shared. 3 years had passed since our divorce, but in that moment, it felt as though no time had passed at all. The emotions resurfaced with startling intensity, dragging me into the past even as I stood firmly in the present. That's how I found myself here, staring through the glass at the woman who once promised me forever, only to break that promise. Instead of being the one sitting beside her, I was now an outsider looking in. It was clear her wish had come true in the end, though the journey that led me to this point was anything but simple. All of my troubles had begun a few years back when I had to travel to Albany for a meeting with a client. Wanting to avoid a long and tiring drive back the same day, I decided to spend the night there. My plan seemed solid until, barely an hour into the trip, my phone rang. It was my client, apologizing profusely. He explained that his car had been in a fender bender. Thankfully, he was unharmed, but the meeting would have to be postponed. At the time, I assured him it was no problem, even though I wasn't thrilled about the situation. Secretly, I was relieved. I hadn't felt fully prepared for the presentation anyway, and this unexpected change gave me the chance to return home early. An idea formed: I could surprise Susan with a romantic evening together. Excited by the thought, I turned the car around and started back toward home. Nearly an hour and a half later, as I finally drove down my street, something unusual caught my eye. 3 unfamiliar cars were parked in our driveway. My first thought was that Susan must have invited some of her girlfriends over, something she often did when I traveled for work. It seemed harmless enough, so I didn't dwell on it. Instead, I parked my car on the street, eager to walk through the door and surprise my wife with an evening neither of us had planned. As I stepped into the house, I assumed everything was fine. But almost immediately, something felt off. The first thing that caught my eye was a scattered pile of clothes on the living room floor, 4 sets, none of which were mine. I froze, my mind racing to make sense of it, just as I heard a sound that sent a chill through me. It was my wife's voice, screaming, not a cry for help, but a fervent, unmistakable cry of pleasure. A sound I knew all too well, though this time it was a dagger to my heart. The realization hit me like a freight train: my wife was upstairs, with someone else. My stomach dropped, and I felt the ground beneath me shift as my world crumbled. Every part of me wanted to turn around and leave, but I couldn't. I needed to see for myself. Against my better judgment, I forced myself to climb the stairs, each step heavier than the last. As I reached the top, her voice grew louder, filled with an intensity one had never heard before. My hands trembled as I peeked around the frame of our bedroom door. What I saw shattered whatever remained of my heart. 3 men, strangers, except for one, were in the room with her. 2 were unfamiliar, but the third was her boss, Jeff Davis. I'd always disliked him, though I never imagined I'd have a reason like this to justify my instincts. And there she was, my wife, entangled with all 3 of them at once. My breath caught as I watched Jeff lean back with a smug grin and speak words that burned into my memory: "Sue, you're an incredible woman. I love having you, and clearly, so do my clients. You've really gone above and beyond for them, and it shows." My mind reeled as the implication hit me. Jeff wasn't just participating in this, it seemed he was orchestrating it. He was using her to curry favor with his business associates. I stood frozen as the scene continued, my wife responding to their degrading words and actions with a wild abandon I had never seen in our decade of marriage. This wasn't the woman I thought I knew, and it wasn't the life I had signed up for. I couldn't bear to watch anymore. Quietly, I backed away from the doorway. They were too engrossed to notice my retreat, which felt both insulting and merciful. I made my way back downstairs, my mind swirling with disbelief and fury. Once in my office, I found my old digital video camera and checked its battery. There was a partially used tape still inside, with just enough space left. I didn't intend to capture a full account, only enough evidence to solidify my case when the time came to take this to my lawyer. Quietly, I crept back to the bedroom door, my video camera in hand, and began recording. I focused on capturing clear shots of my wife's face and the other men in the room. It was difficult, emotionally gut-wrenching, to witness and document the scene unfolding before me. I only managed about 5 or 10 minutes of footage before I had to stop. That was all I could bear. Some might find such a scene enticing, even thrilling, but for me, it was the opposite. It was soul-crushing. The woman I had vowed to love and cherish had become a stranger before my eyes, engaging in acts that shattered every ounce of trust and respect I once held for her. My heart ached, and my body felt hollow, as if the betrayal had drained the life from me. Quietly, I retreated downstairs, trying to gather my thoughts and calm myself. In my office, I opened the safe and retrieved my gun, flipping the safety off. I'm not a violent man by nature, but I wasn't in the mood to take any chances. If things escalated or they decided to confront me, I was prepared to defend myself. The weight of the gun in my hand felt strangely steady, a rare anchor in the storm of emotions swirling within me. I walked back to the living room and saw the clothes scattered across the floor, their pockets brimming with wallets and keys. A plan began to form in my mind, sharp and satisfying. One by one, I collected all their car keys and wallets, a grim sense of justice guiding my actions. Stepping outside, I methodically deflated the tires on all the vehicles parked in the driveway, including my wife's car. By the time I returned inside, a mischievous smile had crept across my face. I felt like a vengeful spirit, one with a plan. Back inside, I remembered seeing my wife's phone on the bedside table while recording earlier. That gave me an idea. I grabbed my phone, positioned myself behind the staircase, and dialed her number. The line rang several times before her voicemail picked up. Unfazed, I hung up and redialed every 2 minutes, knowing she'd eventually feel obligated to answer. After a few attempts, she finally picked up. I imagined her hastily shushing the room, as the house had gone completely silent. "Hey, Bobby," she greeted me, breathless. "How's Albany?" Her voice was filled with forced cheer, but I could detect the strain in her tone. She was trying too hard to sound casual. "You sound out of breath," I replied, feigning concern. "Everything okay?" "Oh, yeah," she stammered, searching for an excuse. "I had to run up the stairs to answer your call." The lie hit me like a slap, but I kept my voice even. "Good to hear. Just wanted to check in." I ended the call before she could say more, then positioned myself near the front door, camera in hand. Moments later, I heard muffled voices and the sound of the bedroom door opening. My wife had stepped out onto the porch to take another call or perhaps to compose herself. As soon as I saw my opportunity, I made my move. With a swift motion, I slammed the front door shut and locked it behind her. Her startled face turned toward the sound, and for the first time, our eyes met. As I closed the door, Susan's face appeared in the side window, her expression desperate, her voice trembling as she pleaded with me to let her in. Her tone hinted at regret, but I wasn't interested in hearing excuses or explanations. "The time for talking is over," I said firmly, my words muffled through the glass. Moments later, the other men emerged onto the porch, their voices loud and insistent. They banged on the front door, demanding their keys and wallets. Their entitlement, their audacity, was almost laughable. I wasn't about to let them retrieve anything without consequences. Eventually, I called the police to deal with the chaos. They arrived quickly, and I handed over the items I had collected. The officers jotted down everyone's names and details for their report. The senior policeman, however, turned to me with a grim expression. "If your wife invited these men into your house and they're all over the age of 18, there's not much we can do for you," he said plainly, his disdain for the situation evident in the way he glanced at Susan, as though she were something unpleasant stuck to his shoe. "I'd suggest counseling, or something like that." The officer's words stung, but I held my composure. "Call a taxi for them," I replied tersely. "Mrs. Thomas will not be allowed back into the house tonight." One of the men ended up calling a taxi on his own, likely realizing there was nothing left for him here. For some reason, that small concession brought me a sliver of satisfaction. But the moment was fleeting, and my good mood evaporated when I went back upstairs to our bedroom. The stench of sweat and sleep hung heavily in the air, turning my stomach. The scent alone ignited a fury in me that I couldn't suppress. I tore into the room, fueled by anger and disgust, and began destroying everything in sight. The mattress was the first to go. I ripped it from the bed and hurled it onto the front lawn. Then I went to the garage, grabbed my toolbox, and dismantled the bed frame piece by piece. Each part joined the mattress on the grass, a public display of my resolve to rid my life of the betrayal. Returning to the bedroom, I spotted Susan's phone lying on the floor. I picked it up and scrolled through it, my heart sinking as I uncovered more evidence of her deceit. In her belongings, I found a set of DVDs, 7 or 8 in total. The plastic cases were cracked, but the discs themselves were intact. Curiosity and dread gripped me as I examined the titles. They confirmed everything I didn't want to believe. Carrying the DVDs downstairs, I placed them on the living room shelves for review. I had to know the full extent of what I was dealing with. The first video revealed Susan with her best friend, Sarah, at Sarah's house. It was filmed during one of the so-called Avon parties Susan claimed to attend every Tuesday and Thursday. What I saw had nothing to do with makeup or sales pitches. Instead, it shattered the trust I'd placed in her and in the world I thought I understood. As I watched, I realized the depth of her deception. Everything I thought I knew, everything I believed in, crumbled around me. At that moment, nothing else mattered. My gaze fell on Susan's computer sitting on the desk. On a whim, I pressed the spacebar, and the screen flickered to life. My stomach churned as I navigated through the system. Determined to gather everything I could, I connected an external drive and began copying every file, email, photo, and video stored on her computer. The process took about an hour, during which I paced back and forth, replaying the events of the night in my mind. Once the transfer was complete, I sat down and started combing through the files. What I found made my blood run cold. Videos, more of the same explicit kind I'd already discovered on the DVDs, were buried within her folders. Photos of her, suggestive and indecent, that wouldn't look out of place on an adult site, stared back at me from the screen. My disbelief deepened with each new file I opened. Then I found the messages, conversations between Susan and the various men she'd been involved with. The tone of her exchanges sent a fresh wave of betrayal washing over me. One message stood out. "I really loved him at one time, but the excitement of the last few years is just too much to give up. Jeff and Bill from work hint at promotions and raises, including rises in their pants. I laugh. I also want at least the house and a car, and if I play this right, I can even get a little alimony every month." Reading her cold, calculating words made my heart sink further. She had no regrets, no guilt, just selfish ambitions and manipulations. My stomach turned as I read her thoughts about me. She dismissed me with a level of detachment that made my head spin. After hours of delving into the files, I felt like I needed to take the next step. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was strategic. She had planned every detail, and I needed to do the same. I went to bed, though sleep was elusive. I spent most of the night tossing and turning, the weight of what I'd uncovered pressing down on me. The next morning, I called in sick to work. My head was too clouded to focus on anything but the chaos in my life. Once that was done, I picked up the phone and dialed my best friend, Ted. Ted wasn't just my closest confidant, he was also my lawyer, the one I trusted with most legal matters. To my relief, his secretary, Mary, answered. I had known Mary almost as long as I'd known Ted, and her calm demeanor steadied me. "Mary, I need to meet with Ted urgently," I said. "This can't wait." "Unfortunately, Ted's in court all day," she replied, apologetic but firm. "Tell him I need an hour of his time," I insisted, my tone even but resolute. "If it's inconvenient, he can call me back before noon, but I can't wait long. This is important." Mary reassured me she'd get the message to him, and I hung up, feeling a mix of frustration and determination. Ted had no idea what was coming, but I knew he'd take this seriously once he heard the whole story. I grabbed my things and stepped out the door, ready to begin the next chapter in this unfolding disaster. As I stepped outside, I couldn't help but take in the sight of the front lawn. It looked like a bizarre yard sale, pieces of the broken bed strewn across the grass, along with piles of Susan's clothes. The chaos of the previous night was on full display for anyone passing by. One of my elderly neighbors gave me a small wave, his expression caught somewhere between amusement and curiosity. I walked over, deciding there was no harm in telling him a condensed version of the story. I explained the events of the evening before, giving him just enough detail about Susan's new lifestyle to satisfy his curiosity. As I spoke, he listened intently, nodding occasionally but never interrupting. Then, I handed him an envelope containing some of the evidence I'd collected. He raised an eyebrow but accepted it without question. I could see his mind working as he absorbed everything I had said, his expression a mixture of disbelief and understanding. It wasn't every day you heard a story like mine, after all. Once I finished, he finally broke his silence. "Well, Bobby," he began, his voice calm but firm. "As they say, first things first. You've got a lot to handle, but it sounds like you're already ahead of the game." I told him about Bill Evans, one of Susan's bosses, who had requested a meeting later that day. My neighbor leaned back, his demeanor shifting to one of quiet contemplation. "I've known you for a long time," he said, his tone steady. "And I know you're a good man. But this situation, it calls for strategy. A full frontal attack on Susan and her company might just be your best option." I nodded, the pieces of a plan forming in my mind. What I had in my possession, video footage of Susan with Jeff Davis and Bill Evans in their office, was an ace up my sleeve. Ted, my lawyer and longtime friend, had already hinted that this evidence could put her bosses in serious legal jeopardy. Their actions didn't just involve Susan, they could lead to severe consequences for everyone involved. Ted had also suggested that once Bill Evans learned what I had on him, his attitude would shift dramatically. "They'll probably try to settle with you," he'd said. "But don't accept anything less than what you deserve." "How much are we talking?" I asked, still trying to gauge what my position might be worth. "If it's less than $2 million, they can forget it," I replied bluntly. The thought of negotiating any less felt insulting, considering the humiliation and betrayal I'd endured. Ted chuckled, though his focus quickly returned to the task at hand. "All right," he said, shifting into his professional mode. "Let me take the lead here. As your lawyer, I need to make some calls and clarify a few things. Don't interrupt when I'm speaking, it's important we approach this the right way." I nodded, appreciating his confidence. He picked up the phone and started dialing. Though I couldn't make out every word, I caught the tone of the conversation. It was calm but firm, a measured approach I'd come to expect from Ted over the years. "Hi, Susan," I heard him say after a pause. "This is Ted." "Yes, I've already spoken with Bobby." You know, he's a great guy, and my friend. Even without hearing the rest of her response, I could imagine her reaction. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was back in control, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. I couldn't shake the thought of how differently someone else might have handled my situation. If it were my Katie, one of the officers had remarked earlier, I'd probably be in jail right now. His words stayed with me, a mix of solidarity and brutal honesty. He was right, I'd managed to keep my temper under control, but it hadn't been easy. As for Susan's belongings, the computer, the phone, and anything else that wasn't in the house that morning, the officer had been blunt. "You'll have to ask the other owner of the house about those things," he said, barely masking his disdain. "Perhaps he left them all on the lawn with your clothes, and someone took them. I really can't say." The officer's tone carried an undercurrent of irony, but his words only served to remind me of the messy reality I was dealing with. He had finished the necessary paperwork for the house, pointing out that, for now, both Susan and I still had equal rights to it. Yet the idea of her claiming any part of what was once ours felt almost unbearable. "I wish I could see her face to face again," I admitted to my friend Ted later, my voice low and tinged with exhaustion. "Just to tell her how I really feel. But honestly, I don't know if I can handle the pain of seeing her again, not right now." Ted nodded, his expression understanding but firm. "I hear you, Bobby," he said, then quickly shifted gears, his tone suddenly lighter and more optimistic. "But for now, I need you to do two things for me." "What's that?" I asked, slightly wary but willing to follow his lead. "First," Ted said, holding out his hand, "get me those videos. The ones from last night." I pulled out the envelope I had brought with me and handed him the recordings. Among them were the tape from the night before, the footage of Tony at the tennis club, and a particularly revealing video of Susan with a woman named Ellie. Ted's eyes lit up as he examined the evidence. "I'm sorry," he said after a moment, noticing my somber expression. "I know Sue really hurt you. I wasn't trying to make light of that, I'm just excited because of what we found here. This changes everything." I nodded, trying to suppress the fresh wave of bitterness that rose within me. "I get it, Ted," I replied. "But this hasn't exactly been easy to process." Ted motioned for me to come closer. "Bobby, come here. I need you to look at something," he said, his voice taking on a sharper edge of focus. I moved to stand behind him, peering over his shoulder as he worked. "Did you watch the full tape that Tony made at the tennis club with Sue?" he asked, glancing up at me. I shook my head. "No. I only skimmed through some of the footage last night. To be honest, I couldn't get through it without feeling sick." Ted paused, a knowing look crossing his face. "Well, you're going to want to see this," he said, his voice brimming with intrigue. "We're meeting with Tony today at the tennis club at 4, and trust me, you're going to be glad we're doing this." As Ted began to explain his plan, I couldn't help but smile. His confidence was contagious, and for the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope. Ted wasn't just a friend, he was a brilliant lawyer, and it was clear he had a strategy that could turn the tables in my favor. I felt a sense of relief knowing that Ted was on my side. His confidence and sharp wit were exactly what I needed to navigate the chaos my life had become. Together, we left his office and headed downtown for our 2 p.m. meeting with Bill Evans. Armed with a portable DVD player, a set of photographs we'd printed earlier, and a few legal envelopes, we were well prepared for what was to come. When we arrived at Susan's office building, we went straight to Bill's office on the top floor. The receptionist waved us in, and as we entered, Bill greeted me with a faint air of cordiality. His demeanor, however, shifted slightly when he saw Ted accompanying me. "Just you and me, Mr. Thomas?" Bill asked, his tone suggesting he preferred it that way. "No," I replied firmly. "I thought I'd bring Ted along. Whatever you have to say to me, you can say to him." I didn't leave room for negotiation, and though Bill didn't seem pleased, he accepted Ted's presence with a tight nod. Despite his apparent reluctance, he focused his attention solely on me, ignoring Ted entirely. This only brought a knowing smile to Ted's face. He was already 2 steps ahead. I couldn't help but feel amused, knowing what was coming. "Bob, can I call you Bob?" Bill asked, attempting a casual tone. "No problem at all," I replied, feigning politeness. I actually thought it would be nice to have Jeff Davis at this meeting as well. At the mention of Jeff's name, Bill's demeanor shifted again. "Jeff? Why would he need to be here?" he asked, his voice tinged with unease. "Oh, I don't know," Ted interjected smoothly, his words dripping with subtle menace. "Unless you two enjoy incest." Bill froze, his brow furrowing in confusion and indignation. "What?" he snapped, his tone rising. "What are you talking about? Incest? What the hell does that mean?" Ted, ever the professional, remained calm and composed. "Well," he began, placing the portable DVD player on Bill's desk, "as they say, a picture is worth 1,000 words." Ted handed a set of printed stills to Jeff Davis, who had entered the room moments earlier. Bill, still fuming, looked to Jeff for an explanation. But Jeff's face told the entire story. His eyes widened to the size of saucers, his expression a mix of shock and dread as he stared at the images in his hands. "As you can see," Ted continued, his tone as casual as if he were discussing the weather, "these are stills from a video you'll be watching in just a moment." Jeff fumbled with the papers, his hands trembling slightly as he processed the implications of what he was holding. Bill, meanwhile, was visibly growing more agitated. Ted seized the moment. "Here's the deal," he said, leaning forward and fixing Bill with a steely gaze. "First, you will issue a formal letter of resignation from Susan's position at your company. Second, we expect Jeff Davis to do the same. Third, we want a monetary offer that does not insult our intelligence." Bill opened his mouth to protest, but Ted cut him off. "And let me be clear," he continued, his voice firm. "We will only consider your first offer. You'll have 5 business days to make it, and we will respond with a simple yes or no." Ted's words hung in the air like a challenge. "Fail to comply," he added, "and we plan to take this to court within the next 2 months, or sooner, if necessary." Jeff was still staring at the stills in stunned silence, while Bill's face turned red with frustration. Before either of them could muster a response, Ted pressed play on the DVD player, ensuring their argument, if they had one, would fall on deaf ears. Ted pressed play on the portable DVD player and rotated the screen so Bill could see. The footage was explicit and incriminating, showing both men taking turns having love with Susan in their office conference room. Jeff, seated nearby, turned pale, avoiding the screen entirely. He didn't need to watch, he knew what was coming. "Gentlemen," Ted began, his voice sharp and deliberate, "this is a clear abuse of power and a textbook example of inappropriate conduct with an employee. It's also grounds for legal action, and it directly impacts your employment and future promotions." As Ted spoke, Bill's face darkened with anger and embarrassment, while Jeff shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Sensing the moment had peaked, Ted shut the DVD player, calmly collected the photos and the player itself, and motioned for me to follow him. Bill and Jeff, meanwhile, were left staring at each other, no doubt preparing for an uncomfortable and heated conversation. Ted and I exited the office without looking back, though I had a question burning in my mind. Just as I began to ask, Ted gestured for me to wait. "Not here," he said firmly, his eyes darting to the corner where Susan stood, partially hidden, trying to eavesdrop. She quickly turned away when she realized Ted had noticed her. The last thing I heard as we left the building was Bill yelling into Julie's intercom, demanding a drink. Once we were outside, Ted finally turned to me. "Let's grab a beer," he said. "There's something I need to talk to you about, but I want to do it over a drink." We drove across town to a quaint bar restaurant near the tennis club. Ted ordered 2 beers, and as soon as they arrived, he leaned in. "Listen, Bobby," he said, his tone serious but measured. I think Bill Evans will make you an offer, but it's probably going to be a little less than $1 million. His legal team is sharp, I've worked with them before. They know when to cut their losses, but they also know how to avoid overpaying. What do you think I should do? I asked, feeling the weight of the decision ahead. First, we hear him out, Ted replied. See what he has to offer. If the number isn't fair, I'll finalize the necessary paperwork that same day. And trust me, Bobby, I have contacts at 3 local news stations and a couple of newspapers. They'd be more than happy to air this story, even if it means slapping blue bars over the sensitive parts. I let out a bitter chuckle at the thought. Ted, you've always had my back, and I trust your judgment completely. I just wish this whole mess never happened. Ted placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. I get it, Bobby. We'll get through this. Just let me handle the next steps. We finished our beers and headed over to the tennis club for our next meeting. As we walked in, I noticed Mr. Ryle, the club's manager, standing stiffly by the entrance. It was clear he didn't like Ted, his body language and icy greeting made that obvious from the start. All right, Worth, Ryle said, addressing Ted curtly. You called this meeting. Let's get on with it. Ted smirked, clearly unaffected by Ryle's hostility. Oh, we'll finish it, he replied, his voice calm but commanding. Let's just see how this plays out. I want to get this over with as quickly as possible, Mr. Ryle said, his tone devoid of any warmth. His eyes flicked between me and Ted with visible irritation. Ted, unfazed, introduced me. Mr. Ryle, this is Bob Thomas, he said, gesturing toward me. His wife, Susan, is a paying member of your club. Unfortunately, it's come to our attention that Tony Simba, your tennis instructor, has been having an inappropriate affair with Mrs. Thomas. Ryle's expression hardened, but he didn't say a word. Ted, always prepared, pulled out the portable DVD player and set it on the desk in front of him. Without hesitation, he pressed play and turned the screen toward Ryle. The video left little to the imagination, showing Tony and Susan in compromising situations. Ryle's face darkened as he watched, and it was clear he wasn't pleased with what he was seeing. Before he could form a response, Ted spoke again, his words sharp and deliberate. Harry, he began, using Ryle's first name as if to remind him of the gravity of the situation, you, with full knowledge of this, and with the complicity of your employee, allowed a paying member of your club, Mrs. Susan Thomas, a married woman, to be exploited on your premises. The tension in the room was palpable as Ryle weighed his options. Finally, with a bitter smirk, he spoke. Ted, you're a real piece of work. But I can't argue with your logic. I'll call you tomorrow with my offer. But let's be clear, if I pay, all of these tapes will come back to me and will never see the light of day. And Tony will be fired immediately. Voluntarily. Ted nodded, a slight smile tugging at his lips. Fair enough, he said, closing the DVD player and slipping it back into his bag. As we turned to leave, Ted glanced back with a parting shot. Oh, by the way, say hello to Tito Martinez for me. Go to hell, Ryle snapped as we walked out, his anger barely contained. Outside the office, I could feel the weight of everything beginning to lift, though there was still much to resolve. In the weeks that followed, it became clear that Ryle had underestimated Ted's determination. He tried to minimize the damage but the evidence was too overwhelming. Even the judge in court wasn't impressed and footage of Tony and Susan in the private locker rooms was revealed. The situation spiraled out of his control. In the end, the settlement came through. I gave Susan the house and car she'd wanted, though I didn't owe her a penny in child support. Our court appearances were brief, and I only saw her twice. Both times, I greeted her with a pointed, "Hello, Susan," a sharp edge to my voice that left her in tears. I couldn't help but wonder why she was crying then, and not before she had destroyed everything we'd built. Life moved on. I told myself to focus on the positives, to rebuild, to let go of the bitterness. I worked out regularly, slimming down and getting stronger. An old baseball injury in my knee was finally fixed, thanks to the settlement money from Jeff and Bill's company. My wardrobe changed too, tailored suits and polished shoes became my norm. I made it a point to look sharp whenever I stepped out in public. With time, I adjusted to my new reality. My old life, my old marriage, and the betrayal that came with it faded further into the background. What remained was a version of myself I was finally proud to be. I decided to break the silence first. "You look great today, Susan," I said, my tone laced with a touch of sarcasm. "I almost forgot how good you could look." I knew how to push her buttons, even after all these years, and I was hoping she'd take the bait. Instead, tears began streaming down her face. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and that's when I noticed it, a massive engagement ring gleaming on her finger. She didn't say a word, just turned and walked into the ladies' room, leaving me standing there with a mix of emotions I couldn't quite untangle. As I stood, lost in thought, a man approached me. His expression was tense, his demeanor defensive. "I take it you're Bob Thomas, Sue's ex-husband?" he asked, his tone dripping with disdain. "That's me," I replied, meeting his glare. "And you must be the latest wish come true." My words were sharp, deliberate, and the flash of anger on his face told me they'd hit their mark. "I'm Sue's CFO," he said, trying to muster some bravado. "And if I were you, I'd stop calling her that." He was trying to sound brave, but I could see right through him. He was rattled, and I wasn't about to let him off easily. "Fine," I said with a wry smile. "Just one last question. Have you ever looked under the bottom drawer of the dresser in your living room?" "What?" "No," he replied, his confusion evident. "Why on earth would I do that?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I let the weight of my next words hang in the air. "The 3 questions I just asked you are exactly why Susan and I are no longer together. And just so you know, I still have all the materials from the divorce. The legal documents, the emails from Sarah, and hours of videotapes. I've carried them with me for the past 3 years. I thought you might find them enlightening." His face paled as I placed a thick envelope on the table between us. Without a word, he opened it, pulled out a single letter, and began reading. His expression didn't change, it remained a stone mask of calm, though I could tell the contents were shaking him to his core. He grabbed a pen, scribbled something quickly on the back of the letter, and then, to my surprise, stood up and left the restaurant without looking back. No acknowledgement, no thanks, nothing. He was gone as abruptly as he had arrived. Curious, I leaned over to see what he had written. Scrawled hastily on the letter were the words. "I'll go back to the house in a minute. Please stay here, and I'll call you back in 15 minutes. Please wait." I couldn't help but wonder if he had found something under the dresser drawer after all. Susan was crying when she returned, but before she could speak, I turned and left. That was the last time I saw her. Even now, I still wonder what Peter discovered that day, or if he ever found anything at all. Some questions don't have answers, and maybe it's better that way.